Okay, welcome everyone to the Center for Ethics and Human Values Care panel on how we should think about research misconduct. This program is co-sponsored by the Office of Research with support from OSUMC Center for Bioethics and the College of Public Health. I'm Dana Howard. I'm a philosopher and bioethicist in the Center of Bioethics and also in the Department of Philosophy. And today we're going to be talking all about research misconduct. So research misconduct is often understood as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. But recently, some have advocated to expand the definition to include behaviors such as sexual harassment, sabotage, and deceptive uses of statistics. This panel will explore whether we should really expand the understanding of the concept. We'll discuss what is the distinctive harm of research misconduct and how we can safeguard against such behaviors in the research community. And I'm so excited to have the panelists that we have. So from our external panelist who's going to start the conversation is David Resnik, who's a bioethicist and senior ethics specialist at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences at the NIH. He's a leading expert on research misconduct. Dr. Resnik has published over 250 articles and 9 books on various topics in philosophy and bioethics, and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And we have 2 awesome panelists from OSU. We have Dr. Nichols Larsen, who is the director of the School of Health and Rehabilitation Science, and also is an associate dean in the College of Medicine and associate vice president for health sciences. Dr. Nichols Larsen's scholarship focuses on the impact of CNS injury, rehabilitation methods, and natural recovery on neural networks and reorganization. And she also has an educational scholarship and training focus on preparing professional students to work as interdisciplinary teams to provide healthcare services to at-risk populations that are living in poverty. And we also have Dr. Michael Oglesbee, who is a professor of veterinarian biosciences and is the director of the OSU Infectious Diseases Institute. He's also faculty lead of the OSU Infectious Diseases Discovery Theme and is director of the College Summer Research Program and Infectious Diseases Signature Program. And his research focuses on virus heat shock protein interactions related to infection, virulence, and impact on innate and adaptive antiviral immunity. Both have taken on leadership positions that have had to deal institutionally with research misconduct. So we're really delighted to have the 2 of you here to share your own thoughts and experiences. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to start out with Dr. Resnik, and he's going to give sort of a framing overview of some of these issues, why they're important, how we should think about research misconduct. And then we're going to open up the floor to Dr. Nichols Larsen and Dr. Oglesbee to sort of share your own experiences and your own thoughts and responses to some of the way in which this was framed. I have some set questions that we'll talk about, but as always, there's a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We really want to hear questions that you have and sort of share your own experiences. So feel free throughout the presentation to type up some questions, and we should have the last 15 to 20 minutes to focus on those. All right, so to no further ado, let's have Dr. Resnik start us off.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about just misconduct, sort of giving a big picture view of what this thing is, and then we'll just have the panel. So we think of it in a really just very, very general sense. You can think of misconduct as just unethical behavior, inappropriate behavior. So in science, scientific research misconduct would be unacceptable behavior in science. Now, we take a step back. I guess a lot of people are familiar with the federal definition, but we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, why would we have such a definition in the first place, right? What are we doing with it? What purpose does it serve? Well, there's some obvious ones and maybe not so obvious ones. Obviously, promote research integrity in research institutions, and in the scientific profession more generally, to prevent unethical research misconduct. So there's kind of a positive and a preventive negative thing. I think it's also useful to teach students and trainees about ethical conduct of research. I think a large part of teaching is letting students know what the standards are, and it's useful to have some written down standards for teaching purposes. Also, it's important just to enforcing general standards of conduct and research. Assuring accountability for public money. That's a huge reason for having some kind of a definition, because at least for federally funded research, people want to have their money spent properly and don't want to have research being faked and other bad things happening. In a bigger sense, just maintaining the public trust. You have to have some ethical standards in your profession for public trust, and this is true in science as it is anywhere else. Then you have other things, protect animal and human research subjects, and protect the institution from legal or financial liability. And that's especially when you get into things like fraud, civil, criminal fraud, things like that, where you're going to be facing lawsuits and all kinds of problems. So I think we can distinguish between different types of definitions. There are what I would call minimalist definitions and aspirational definitions. So minimalists are narrow in scope. They're pragmatic. They focus on preventing the core misbehaviors, which think people that think are the most important ones to deal with. They're enforceable. So, you're not going to just haul someone before the research integrity officer because they're a bad person. You have to have some specific things that you clearly define that they've done wrong. And so an example of this is the federal definition, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, which has actually gotten more minimalist. It used to be a little bit more aspirational. Aspirational definitions are wide-ranging in scope. So they could cover a lot of things, and some do. They're idealistic. They're seeking to promote the best possible behavior, not just a minimal standard of behavior. And because of this, they may not be easily enforceable because they can get general and vague and difficult to enforce. And if you look at the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, it's a very nice document. It's been revised recently, but it is very much in the aspirational mode. So just to put it up there, we're all familiar, I think, with the federal definition. It took a while to adopt this. It was really a debate that took place in the 90s among federal agencies and researchers and government officials that finally narrowed it down to the FFP definition that we're all familiar with. Now, it's worth noting that the other serious deviations category was thrown out. So that was in earlier definitions. And actually, I think it had been used by NSF to prosecute somebody for sexual harassment even. But that was thrown out because people regarded it as too vague, too general, difficult to enforce. I mean, any number of things could follow under other serious definitions category. So the way things have sort of worked out today is that we also have what researchers will call questionable research practices. That's another thing that I think is part of the terms that we've now used. So if you look at misconduct on the left side and then ethical research on the right side, say fabrication, falsification, that's misconduct. Honest, accurate, and unbiased, and transparent and open reporting, analysis, and interpretation of data, that's ethical. And then you have questionable things in between here, like poor record keeping, p-hacking, and other questionable uses of statistics, inappropriate preparation and selection of images, and overstating significance of your results. Actually, I have poor record keeping twice. Maybe that's because I think it's really important to keep good research records. And then plagiarism, you can see where you have plagiarism and then appropriate citation and then things that are in the middle. So other things then that are not misconduct or questionable research practices are what would be called other misconduct. And this sort of category goes back to a 1992 National Academies report on this, I believe. But anyway, in this report, they said there's a lot of things that are widely regarded as seriously unethical, but they're not unique to science, like sexual and other harassment, bullying, discrimination, financial fraud, mismanagement of funds. So these things are then other misconduct. Now, in the last few years, there's been some serious talk about expanding the definition of research misconduct again. And I think the most energy has come in the area of sexual harassment. And we have actually seen the American Geological Physical Union and AAAS have expanded their definitions of misconduct to include sexual and other harassment. NSF has actually, I know, been considering whether to add sexual harassment to its official definition of misconduct. Now, I think something that's given some energy to this is that, we've all known that sexual harassment has been a problem in science for years. I mean, that's nothing new, and the mistreatment of women and other people in science has gone on for years. But what's given it more energy recently is things like the Me Too movement, and then the Me Too movement in science. And there have also been some cases. I think there was a case of sexual harassment down in Antarctica, an Antarctic station. It was NSF funded, but I think the details, and someone could correct me on this, but existing policies did not clearly cover that situation. So that if it had happened on campus, this person could have been brought up for sexual harassment under these campus policies and things like that and fired and whatnot. But because it happened down in the Antarctic, there was not, a policy that really applied. So people were arguing, well, the federal policy should apply to you because this was NSF money. Then we should be able to apply that definition to them and punish them that way for what they did. There's been less talk, although some have suggested things like not disclosing significant financial interests, and also things like tampering with research. Now, in my own research, I've noticed that many definitions already go beyond the federal definition of many institutions. So all of them have FFP. They're required to if they want to get money from the NSF or the NIH, but 59% went beyond FFP in their definitions. You can see a lot of them still have the other serious deviations category, and there's other things up there too that they include. And also another survey I did with looking at countries around the world, basically they all included FFP, but about the same percentage, a high percentage included other things like unethical authorship and unethical publication practices and things like that. And I should mention that a lot of these were European countries that were following the European Code, which has a lot of this stuff in it. So what are some criteria for expanding the definition? Well, I would throw out something to think about. Maybe these are not good criteria. We can talk about that. First, the behavior has to be widely regarded as seriously unethical. I think most people would agree there's no point in dealing with things that are not major concerns. Also, it has to substantially undermine the integrity of science. And that does not necessarily mean that it has to undermine the integrity of the research record like fabrication and falsification do. Plagiarism, after all, is regarded as misconduct. And the primary problem with plagiarism is that it poisons the research environment by breeding mistrust and animosity and all kinds of problems when you plagiarize. And you could argue that sexual harassment can do the same thing. It's not adequately covered by other policies, laws, and so forth. I think that's a big question to ask about things like sexual harassment, is to the degree to which it really is covered or is not adequately covered by other policies and laws. And whether it can be clearly defined, it should be clearly defined and enforced. And that some things that are, could be problematic because they can't be well defined, like say inappropriate uses of statistics. Statistics is an evolving, field, and it's not easy to say what is or inappropriate in uses of statistics such that it would be, should be, misconduct. So there's debate about whether including other things should be included in the federal definition, like we mentioned. I have argued elsewhere that definitions, it's okay for definitions to serve different purposes. So it's conceivable that a university or professional organization could have a, say, aspirational definition that's kind of expansive in scope, but that the federal definition would still be minimalistic and legalistic because it serves a different kind of purposes. However, if you have different definitions of misconduct, whether it's from universities or federal agencies or among different countries or whatever, it creates the potential for conflict, which I don't know whether that's been a problem, but it's something that I think would have to be addressed. If somebody has done something that is wrong according to one policy, but not according to another, or misconduct according to one, but not another, what do? How do you figure out whether this is misconduct or not, and who has jurisdiction and things like that? So I'm going to stop there, as I've said enough, and I'll turn it over to the panelists to add their remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Deb Larsen, Director of the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences. And when I was first asked to be part of the panel, I was a little confused as to why I was asked, but then I looked back over the last decade or so and my experiences with this, and I realized I have had a few, unfortunately, and most of them centered around either sexual harassment or a power differential. And I think those two things come together. We are working in team science so much of the time, and there is always a senior person as part of that team science. And what I've seen is junior faculty being required to put names of people on their work that didn't contribute to the idea or the research. I've seen junior faculty discouraged from submitting grants on a given topic, and a senior faculty taking their idea and submitting it as their own. I've seen sexual harassment in the form of inappropriate relationships that resulted in questionable research ethics. I think it's very important for us to create a definition that encompasses some of these things. It will help protect our faculty from being abused by senior people. I do know that one of the challenges is senior people may leave one institution and go to another, and they have the capability of sabotaging faculty that brought charges against them as they sit on study sections and other review committees. And so I think it's something that it would be helpful if it was an encompassing definition, not just everyone creating their own. So I guess I want more of the idealistic definition and not the minimalistic definition or aspirational definition versus minimalistic, but it needs to be more universal, because I think these problems are widespread. Why it may be a sexual harassment thing, I think it is more just a harassment thing that takes place between senior folks and junior folks, both junior faculty and students. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Yeah, you know, this is all great. There's one thing that I really want to call out, and those are the pressures that drive misconduct, and they have an interest in the history of science. And you know, research didn't really become a vocation until the 20th century. And as a vocation, you know, there's a need to continually innovate and discover to have impact in order to continue and advance your career. And that's sort of that's a tall order when you mix, you know, impactful discovery with needing to do that on a regular basis to maintain your job. And so this gets back to, in my mind, you know, the importance of looking at the organizational culture. And so I guess I'm less, I tend to focus less on how we define this, or what we include under the umbrella, and I tend to emphasize the drivers. So as an example, at the institutional level, you know, I see in many units a tendency to put a greater emphasis on scholarship and research expenditures and less emphasis on graduate student mentoring. And yet, you know, graduate student mentoring is where we actually form, you know, we form the ethos within which our community evolves. I see variability in terms of how we maximize success, and which is all about mentoring. And we talk about faculty mentoring, but you know, how often do we actually provide opportunities for chalk talks by faculty in departmental meetings, and actually have this be a regular part of our activities? And then, you know, what are the impacts of our expectations for salary recovery? So if the expectation of salary recovery rises above a certain threshold, you're creating a climate which is conducive to misbehavior. You know, what are our safety nets, like bridge funding? And then, you know, at the laboratory level, what are our best practices? You know, I think we would all agree that one-on-one meetings between the PI and staff is key, where you review raw data and not the polished data that comes at a weekly or biweekly lab meeting. But what implications does this have on laboratory size and how you actually structure and provide oversight? The issue of having data stored in a site that's secure but can be accessed by the entire group, which gets back to data ownership. And then, you know, we definitely have what I would call the toxic culture, where within lab competition is actually promoted as a driver for achievement by the group. And this really sets the stage for things like sabotage and other misbehaviors. And then I think the last point is, and this, you touched on this multiple times, this whole issue of co-authorship. You know, I think there are many instances where maybe you belong as a co-author, but are you really fulfilling your obligation as a co-author to look at the entire body of work with a critical eye? And I will say that historically I was very naive, and that, you know, I looked at a final figure and took it for granted that it was, you know, an accurate reflection of the data. But until I served on an actual investigation, I was stunned at how, I mean, data can be manipulated. And so I guess I'm no longer naive, but I remain optimistic that by focusing as much on culture as the definition and the response, we can get where we want to go.
So thank you, the three of you, for really bringing up some of these sort of big picture challenges. And there's so much to unpack. So I have some questions that I'm going to ask, but this is just an invitation for audience members and participants to ask your own questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those shortly. So I guess the first question is really about sort of the FFP, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. So that's how people usually think about it. I really appreciate that the way in which David was presenting it. They're not necessarily, they seem like they're all of a kind, but plagiarism is like interestingly different from fabrication and falsification. And notably, as David was mentioning, you know, it's not always been the case. The research misconduct was just understood as fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, right? And so, you know, why is this trio of research vices so central to the idea of research misconduct? So before we talk about like expanding it, what's the big deal about these three? And I guess, you know, if there is anything missing when we focus only on fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism.
Well, fabrication and falsification seem to go together and seem to be a really big deal because that's when you're talking about the research record and you're talking about knowledge generation, and that is the goal of science. That is the primary goal. So that seems to be why they're there. And I think almost everyone is going to agree they should be there. Now, plagiarism is a little bit different because you could have a plagiarized paper, parts of it that has nothing to do with data or anything, and it doesn't affect the research record. It doesn't affect the generation of knowledge. It is primarily has to do with the social environment of science. Right, we agree. We live in part of the agreement is that we give credit where credit is due, and that's how research works. So, you know, if it may be a cultural and historical accident that plagiarism is thrown in there, it's possible that if we lived in a more socialistic society, less individualistic, plagiarism wouldn't be such a big deal. It might be if there were more women in science when they were coming up, you know, doing all the policy work, that you would have had sexual harassment stay in there or be in there somewhere as in misconduct. So I think that's really the question is what are the most important things that we have to focus on, because it seems like it's going to be totally self-defeating if we throw everything in there. Right? We can't police every behavior that people do. There's just no way, right? So we have to really focus on what we think is the most important.
I think they're also the most obvious. You know, and plagiarism right in there with them, right? It's not easy, but you can identify plagiarism. Except I think when you talk about plagiarism of ideas. And so one of the things I think is challenging with that as a concept, if we love to discuss how we might do things, and if I have a great idea and I share it, and then someone takes that idea and runs with it, that seems to me plagiarism of ideas, but it's almost impossible to prove. When you take plagiarism, as David was saying, in where I've copied verbatim from something and added it into my discussion, then that's easy. The other thing is, though, I think fabrication and falsification are very intentional. And so I think the consistency with which those three things are included are sort of, they're the obvious things to include.
Deb, I like the version of plagiarism that's plagiarism of ideas. I actually experienced this as a junior faculty person when I was starting out. submitting a manuscript that was also part of an R01 application that was a concept I was trying to address. And I was having trouble, getting this material accepted for publication, getting the grant review panel to embrace it. And I was actually invited to a very exclusive scientific meeting to address a major challenge in the field of measles immunology. And I found the concept that I was addressing being presented by a very senior and well-known investigator. And the only reason I was in the meeting was because one of the grant reviewers of my application was intrigued by the concept and invited me to attend a meeting that otherwise a junior faculty person would never have been invited to. Survived that, but it could have been a mortal blow to career development. I just want to address the falsification piece. I think all of this, to me, our biggest challenge is falsification, because we don't have a sharp dividing line between negligence and something that's done recklessly, intentionally, or knowingly. It can be as simple as, hey, I did this experiment 3 times, and the 3rd time I didn't really get the result I wanted, and now I can reverse engineer reasons why I shouldn't include those data in the set. And we're creative people, right? And yet I'm convinced that line is crossed repeatedly. And this is where, of course, documenting it when it happens can be quite difficult. To me, it becomes a bit easier with fabrication, but the falsification, it's not under control. It's somewhat subjective how we draw the line between negligence and recklessness. And if we could address that, that would be a huge step forward.
So let's move on to thinking about potential ways to expand the definition. So sexual harassment has been something that has been talked about a lot in the literature. It's interesting to hear your perspectives, Deb and Michael, about sort of sabotage, and sabotage not only in terms of the data manipulation, but sabotage, career sabotage, and the way in which sabotage works behind the scenes. So other behaviors that David brought up, or that have been brought up in general, is bullying, deceptive use of statistics, and failure to disclose major conflicts of interest. Do you think the definition needs revision in any of these ways? Why or why not?
I can get the ball rolling if you. I have to say, my initial response to sexual harassment as research misconduct, I really had trouble embracing, because to me it's misconduct regardless of the domain. But as that translates to inappropriate relationships, bullying, the example that was given in Antarctica, I get it. I can see how there are domain-specific, research domain-specific concerns there. In terms of deceptive use of statistics, my view is that the biggest problem is what I call statistical naivety. And it's simply, we have plenty of investigators that are not as well-versed in statistics as they should be. And that's not just those that are generating and publishing the data. That applies to manuscript reviewers, grant review panels. We've got a long way to go until we're where we need to be. So I think, documenting intent, which is the deceptive part of deceptive use of statistics, I think that's a long reach.
So I started out with the idea that I think we do need to expand our definitions. I do think, I'm not sure it's always sexual harassment, but I think there's a common theme of harassment often in team science and laboratories. And And while the experiences I have had are centered around more of a sexual harassment nature, it's the power differential that I think is the key component. The idea that you have someone that can control your career in terms of promotion, they sit on the P&T committee, in terms of grants, in terms of publications. And so I think that there has to be a way of making junior faculty and students aware of what is right and then protect them from bullying in the lab.
I like that, the concept of making the power differential the central focus.
Yeah, so I'm open to this expansion, but in terms of logistics, it presents quite a complication because if you think about how the investigations of research misconduct are done, I don't know how many of you have been in these things, but I don't, it's all evidence, it's based on evidence, it's based on review of research records. And then you have a report that goes up to federal agencies and things like that. So what I'm saying is it's usually not a he said versus she said sort of inquiry or investigation. Now that doesn't mean it can't be. It's just that that's a whole different ballgame. Investigating sexual harassment and things like that, and power dynamics and inappropriate relationships. And in most, at least at our institution, this is handled by the civil program. We have people that are specially trained, trained lawyers and social worker, people with the appropriate backgrounds to do these kinds of investigations. So I'm thinking that if you actually, is a practical matter, what you might have to do is have the Office of Research Integrity or the Research Integrity Officer at your institute working with the appropriately trained people to actually investigate sexual harassment. It doesn't seem like it would be kind of like handed off to them, or it would be in collaboration with them. It'd be sort of like if there's a human subjects issue, right, that happens to involve fabrication and falsification and things like that. There are people that are specially trained in human subjects protections that are at institutions, and they would have to be, you'd have to coordinate with them for doing the investigation. So those are my thoughts. It's not that I'm opposed to it, but it just is a logistical matter. It can be very difficult to investigate these things. Get the appropriate people and the right qualifications, the right committee, no conflicts of interest. I mean, it's hard.
It is hard, and it is usually done by two different groups on campus. So you have the HR legal side of Title IX kinds of issues, and then you have the research misconduct that's done through the Office of Research. And it feels like there ought to be a way to bring those two things together somehow, because I think they're missed in the evaluation of both. Because when you're talking about junior people being required to put a name on a paper who didn't have anything to do with it, or are being sabotaged in how they submit grants and things, those aren't really sexual harassment, but they do seem to be more about research misconduct.
So if you're having, so these committees, you have to have qualified experts, right, to do the evaluation, people knowledgeable in the norms of the discipline. So if you're doing a microbiology, fabrication, you have a couple of microbiologists on the committees. For something like bullying, though, it doesn't seem to matter whether you're a microbiologist or a psychologist or a philosopher or whatever. It's just sort of like anybody could be on the committee. I'm not sure. So I don't know how you, or maybe you have qualified people that look, I'm not sure. How do you, as a matter, how it's a practical matter, how do you do this?
I'm just struck by the fact that this is a scientific endeavor of its own, correct? I mean, it's all about collecting data and then interpreting data, and then where do you go from there? I still, and I'm going to put on my infectious disease hat for a moment. I mean, I feel like we're talking about how do we treat the disease, which is clearly important, but you know, in my realm, you know, that's kind of the last gap effort. It's all about understanding the mechanisms that give rise to these situations and addressing those mechanisms, those aspects that initiate what I'm going to call the disease process.
That's really helpful. So maybe, and Michael, you mentioned earlier, like thinking more organizationally about how to sort of safeguard against these activities and practices sort of becoming part of the culture. So, and some of the questions that have come in the Q&A really are related to this challenge. So Jen Weissenberger says, the questions of harassment, toxic in work environments, bullying can be addressed through human resources or other university offices, and typically are. The areas that are not so easily addressed are those of questionable research practices, such as selective use of data, p-hacking, etc. I am not in favor of adding these to research misconduct definition, but wonder if there are ways of addressing these, right? And one final question that I have from the preset sort of list is, you know, finding someone to have actually engaged in research misconduct is the last line of defense to safeguard research integrity. It sometimes takes a lot of expertise to really tease it out. You have to think about the intentionality, all of those issues, right? So what enforcement mechanisms and other institutional practices are already in place that you've seen, but also should be in place to ensure that research misconduct doesn't happen in the first place, and sort of that middle column, sort of to ensure that we move from that middle column of questionable research practices to the right column, ethical practices.
Well, let me get back to, you know, what Michael was saying about or treating the symptoms rather than the disease. I mean, I think everyone would agree that what we have to do is try to promote an ethical research environment, right? And that involves mentoring, education, training, policy development, leadership, auditing. There's a lot of things you can do. And then was said earlier, the misconduct, at least the way it works, is, you know, that's the end of things when things have gone really bad. It's not, I'm not sure how much the definition of misconduct really helps promote integrity in research generally. I'm not sure. It seems like it's this punitive thing and very legalistic. And so I'm not sure that expanding the definition of misconduct will actually help us make the research environment better. I'm not sure. Maybe there's other things we need to do.
You know, I will, to add to that, David, I did 2 terms as a department chair, which I think it's the hardest thing I've ever done at this institution, but I also think it's probably one of the most important roles. And there's a lot of variability in terms of how chairs, I'm going to say, manage or guide or facilitate productivity within their unit. You know, I know that I was involved in addressing a bullying issue. You know, it's the chair that can kind of set the tone for, you know, open sharing of ideas and results in your research groups. And then the last piece of that is, I think there's a big, a major impact on who you recruit, who you hire. You know, I've been around long enough to remember when, you know, it was all about scholarship and funding, and, you know, whoever hit, you know, hit the marks there was the top candidate, but increasingly we're focusing on individual qualities of collegiality. Some of these things are hard to measure, but I think it can go a long way. It's the type of person that you hire that can determine the challenge that you may or may not have down the road. Are they open to mentoring? Because we've had hires. You can put mentoring practices in place, but there are those that are receptive and those that are not.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think education is one thing, to prepare people on how to deal with their collaborators and their senior faculty, but also making sure that we're monitoring better the behavior of those folks. And I don't know how that's done, but we should be able to do it.
So there's a number of questions in the chat that I've hopefully made public, because some of them are just really insightful comments in the form of questions. But the first question that I want to sort of highlight is Abby Norris Turner's sort of invitation to talk a little bit more about how to safeguard junior researchers when we sort of, one of the foundational issues really is this power differential in collaborative relationships, but collaborations are the lifeblood of the academy, but also a source of profound toxicity. And the incentive structure there isn't only, the incentive structure basically disincentivizes whistleblowing, right? So those who have the least power, there's a lot of risk, and there's very little prospect of benefit to actually making, whistleblowing and highlighting these behaviors. And people just like try and sort of focus on getting out as quickly as possible and getting a good job and, not looking back. So how should we think about if, when we start thinking about expanding maybe it's not expanding the definition, but when we start thinking about how to deal with these toxic relationships within research, how can we better incentivize whistleblowing or protect people who are the most vulnerable in these collaborations?
Well, in my experience, I think one of the things that we can do a lot better job of is making counseling available to people. And I don't mean psychological, but, letting people, making confidential counseling available to people, because I've done this before a lot. And, people need to talk. They're facing a lot of pressures, and they need to talk about what's going on, and they're not sure what to do. They're not sure whether they, how to respond to the situation, whether they want to bring up a charge against somebody for this or that, or whether this person did violated policy or what the policy is. So I think that's one of the most important things we can do. And I don't know how many institutions are really doing a good job of that. If you have a young faculty member or a postdoc or a student, do they know who they can go to for confidential advice and discussion? And do they know they can go to this person even if they're not going to do anything at all, even if they're just wanting to talk? This seems to be very important to me.
It's a difficult item to address, but I really think a lot of this should really be, there's a lot of potential for department chairs to play a very active role in this. And I'm not sure it's very clearly spelled out when somebody says these are the roles and responsibilities of a chair. But, the job of the chair is to be a resource for graduate students, professional degree students, faculty, and that should be the resource. And, when you have annual review documents and you lay out publications and you list what your contribution to that particular work was, I mean, red flags can be seen as to whether, wait, is this real or not? And you know, now that we've changed our protocols now, where a chair can sit in on P&T discussions to prevent, you know, a senior faculty person for just, you know, going off against a more junior faculty. Just the presence of the chair in that discussion, I think, really curbs that type of misbehavior. So you know, historically, there used to be an effort to separate the chair from P&T decisions, and I think that was a mistake because it allowed, you know, train wrecks to emerge.
Yeah, I think it's about creating a culture where people feel like they are heard and can be heard and feel safe, whether that's the department chair or a departmental ombudsman or something that functions in that role. The other thing I think is important is to pay attention. We had 3 students want to leave a lab all at the same time.
Yeah.
None of them wanted to tell us why they wanted to leave, but they all wanted to leave. That is a red flag, right? There's something going on. It took us a year to figure it out, but it's a sign that there's something wrong in that lab. And so I think you have to look for signs like that when they happen.
I think that's a huge point. And Deb, you maybe think about a comment that I didn't make. The point of this, I wasn't trying to inflate the role of chair, but it has to be a local, we need local leadership addressing this. You're not going to fix it by having a central, well, I mean, you need the central authority, research compliance, for example, but the preventive measures require leadership that thoroughly understands the local culture, that can form the local culture, that knows the players.
So, oh, sorry, Deb and David.
I was just going to say, totally agree.
I would add something to that. I think there needs to be better coordination among all the different players. Like was mentioned earlier, you know, a lot of times research misconduct cases involve not only, you know, FFP, but actually, you know, bullying and other things are going on that need to be addressed, right? So I think maybe more coordination and recognition, I think, and maybe this is recognition that the ethical behavior is fairly broad in scope. It's about a lot of things. And we do tend to put things in silos like, oh, this is FFP, this is misconduct. Oh, this is sexual harassment. Okay, go to the civil office. Oh, you know, this is a human subjects. Okay, go to that office, right? So I think it would be helpful. I don't know how to make it happen, but I think it's important.
So one question, and it seems like, you know, some of this has been a critical sort of discussion, but there have been places where, you know, even just talking about sexual harassment as a potential like misconduct, also talking about sort of bringing the chairs back in and sort of localizing the ways in which people are paying attention and and being held accountable to some of these practices. So maybe the final question that I want to ask is, you know, it comes from Janet Childerhose, and, you know, for the last year plus, I've been watching with dismay as Twitter threads explode with stories about rampant sexual harassment, bullying, and plagiarism. What sense of hope or optimism can you offer us that we can change the practices and cultures that normalize these behaviors? And, you know, so is there a movement that makes you optimistic and hopeful either within OSU or in like more sort of federally that we can change these cultural behaviors and hold people accountable.
Well, I'm very hopeful because I think these behaviors were mostly kept swept under the rug or not talked about for years, and now we're having the conversation out in the open. So I'm very hopeful in that regard. In another regard, I'm a little bit pessimistic because, well, I mean, maybe I'm realistic. This is human behavior. No one's perfect. Things are going to happen, and we can try to improve, but there's always going to be problems, right? Because we can't expect perfection, but we can improve.
I think the Me Too movement and some of the other things going on nationally have empowered people, women, underrepresented minorities, to speak out more than they probably did in the past. That we're having this discussion, I think, is a critical sign that things are changing, and so that gives me hope. Right, I'm well into my career, and I don't think it's going to change in the 7 months I have left on faculty, but I still have optimism that in the future we will figure out how to deal with all of this.
I'm very optimistic. I think that historically some of the worst transgressions were done within I call them research groups that were islands unto themselves. Where it's like, you could have all the abuse within the household, but nobody knew about it. And I think with interdisciplinary research, even though it poses unique challenges, now all of a sudden, it's a much more open dialogue, because, you're sharing, you can't, it's much more difficult to, if you will, hide these transgressions in that type of community. And that's where we're going research-wise, is functioning more as interdisciplinary teams. That will pose its own unique challenges, but I think the net effect is quite positive.
Well, I want to thank David, Deb, and Michael for this really terrific and thoughtful conversation. There's so much to unpack here, and I really appreciate also the way in which you brought up the fact that research misconduct and questionable research practices lead to human subjects concerns and lead to co-authorship. I mean, all of these, I do really appreciate David's point that sometimes these questions are broken up into silos, and really they do bleed into research integrity more broadly. And I appreciate sort of highlighting how complex this issue is. And so thank you so much. Please join us for next month's panel. I believe it's on December 6th. We're going to be talking about ethical challenges related to research with immigrant populations. It should be a really interesting discussion, and I hope everyone has a good Monday.